Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all doing well. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to click here on another video. And quickly before we get into the review, I just want to say sorry for the lack of content over the course of the last week. Unfortunately, I was a little bit under the weather, so between my day job and coming home, it was honestly a lot more chilling than making content. But because I'm behind on some things, I wanted to try to get the ball rolling once again. And HBO Max, or Max, and now HBO Max again, whatever, just finished up their second season of The Last of Us. The first season was highly acclaimed, and I actually did a full live stream discussion, spoiler discussion with my buddies Q Reviews, as well as Jamie Lee of In the Front Row here on the channel when that first season premiered. And now that the second season has come to a close, I wanted to sit here and ramble about it just a little bit. So if you guys are into up-to-date reviews like this for movies and TV, as well as early reviews for movies and TV, as well as retrospective reviews, live streams, and the occasional vlog, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing, and if you're a returning viewer, as usual, thanks so much for stopping by. Now quickly, in terms of The Last of Us, for anybody who's newer to the channel, I played the original game when it first came out, and I thought it was, like a lot of people, a standout game in that generation of PlayStation titles. It was a great game, a great story, incredibly cinematic, while also being very emotional, and also being a really fun game to play with some cool horror elements to it. Everything about that first season, for the most part, really honored the legacy of that first game, and I think for the most part, The Last of Us Season 1 was a hit with fans. While there were some criticisms about certain things like casting, and we'll get into that in just a little bit, I think for the most part, the reception to that first season was really positive. Now, The Last of Us 2, that game was a mixed bag with audiences. For the most part, it was very highly praised for its gameplay, for its graphics, and for its story, but its story was very controversial for reasons we'll get into in just a second. And I also want to mention that this isn't going to be a play-by-play of everything that happened in the season, but I am going to be talking about things a little bit more openly, so there will be spoilers in this video. Again, not a play-by-play of everything that happened, but I will be speaking about it openly. So with that said, going into this, I knew it was going to be a heavy season. I knew it was going to be an interesting season because of the events of the game. And so I was a little bit worried on whether or not they were really going to be able to stick the landing the same way that the first season did. The first season was able to play off of a story that in a lot of ways is familiar in terms of the notion of having a main character who is this hardened older individual who takes on a father role to a younger individual that they find within some sort of, crazy situation. And it's funny to have Pedro Pascal playing Joel as our main character in the first season, who finds, of course, Bella Ramsey as Ellie in that first season, and of course taking her on like as his daughter. And, of course, he's also played this similar archetype with The Mandalorian and Grogu. So, yeah, I thought that was a funny element. And I loved Pedro Pascal in that first season as Joel. I didn't really know that I was going to love him in that role as much as I did, but he did such a great job. And Bella Ramsey is an actress who's gotten so much crap for this show. But when the first season came out, while I didn't necessarily see her as the Ellie I always envisioned in a live-action adaptation, I think she did a good job of playing the very piece of shit at times, but very cute, but also at times very young and naive kid. She did a good job of playing that young, naive version of Ellie, who can be a bit of a pain in the ass at times, but ultimately is a character that you can find to be endearing, especially when it comes down to that relationship of somebody like Joel, who's now stuck with this kid that's kind of annoying him. I think she did a good job of playing off of him, and their chemistry I thought was really solid. And so going into season 2, if you played The Last of Us 2, then you know that of course Joel dies fairly early into the game. Now, I didn't expect them to kill off Joel in this show as fast as they did. They end up killing him in the second episode. Now, many have said, well, it happens early on in the game, which is true. But something to keep in mind with the games is that they are, close to 20-hour games a lot of times, depending on how you play them. So the experience of the actual gameplay does pad out that experience a little bit more, despite the fact that in the grand scheme of the narrative, Joel does die fairly early into the game. That was an incredibly controversial thing when that game first dropped. I remember just people losing their minds online around the notion of Joel being killed, this very loving, likable character who ultimately is done dirty. And so when it comes down to being able to bring it to the screen in a movie or in a TV show, this was one that was tough, because when you play a video game, it sucks to see a character like that get killed on a cinematic and on a narrative level. But then you do have control of the character who's seeking out revenge. And I do think that the show, unfortunately didn't necessarily benefit from that element here. With Joel being killed so early on in the show, once again played by Pedro Pascal, who's great and does return later on in the season for some flashbacks, I do think it kind of made the show feel very abrupt when it comes down to his killing. I think if you're not familiar with the game whatsoever, you just watch the first season and you think, oh, this is cool, I can only imagine the shock of getting to the second episode and finding that the main character is killed off in a very abrupt, matter-of-fact way. There's no turning back. There's nothing about it that's sugar-coated. It's very straightforward. Anybody who's played the game, of course, knows what's coming. And I think this is where it started to kind of go off the rails for me, because Bella Ramsey, I said this in my review for the first season, is an actress I think is very talented. She showcased that in this show, but she's also showcased that in other things. And it's been disgusting to see all the vile comments that have been made about her, her appearance, and all these different things online that are just completely uncalled for. It's one thing to criticize the show. It's one thing to criticize whether or not she was good in the role, whether or not she should have been cast in the role, but it's a completely different other thing to just completely just become like inhumane in terms of how you're speaking about somebody's appearance, especially somebody so young who clearly has a passion for what she's doing. And she's clearly a talented actress at that. With all of that said, I liked Bella Ramsey in the first season, though she was not the character of Ellie in my mind. She didn't really feel like that character, but I do think for the most part, she does a good job of capturing the essence of that naive, young piece of shit, oftentimes annoying kid who Joel's kind of stuck with. You know, there's a charm to her character. In season 2, based on the game, Ellie becomes a far more gritty, far more edgy character, but the right amount of edge where it doesn't feel cringy. She feels like a character who has been hardened because of her environment, and the fact that she is still younger, even though she is older, of course, in the second game, still makes for her to be a far more compelling character in that second game. Despite your frustrations with the choice to kill Joel in the second game, you can't deny that Ellie becomes a far cooler character in The Last of Us Part 2 than she is in the first game. And so I was worried going into this season that Bella Ramsey was not going to be able to really bring that level of gravitas and grit and edge to the role, because for one, she looks very young. She has a very young face. Everything about her feels like a young kid. Her voice also feels like a young kid. And there really wasn't much about her in the first season that really told me that she was going to be able to sell me on the next chapter of Ellie's story. And I was a little bit torn with the show as we move forward. Now, before we continue on with Ellie, with her being the main character, and my thoughts on what they did with the latter part of this season, I do think it's important to mention that this is only part of The Last of Us Part 2. They did announce prior to the season announcing or dropping or releasing anything that they were going to be splitting the events of The Last of Us Part 2 into more than one season. Now, I thought that meant 2 seasons, but there have been rumors or things being said online that it may possibly be 3 seasons, which is kind of crazy to think that they would stretch out the second game to 2 to 3 seasons, but then they just, did the entirety of the first game in just the one season. I don't necessarily know that we needed it, especially with this season only being 7 episodes, but I do think that's an important thing to keep in mind, because this season ends on a cliffhanger, but also ends in a way that I feel is rather unsatisfying as its own season. Now, I know where this is going because I've played The Last of Us Part 2, but in terms of this being told into a TV show, or if this was to be told into a movie, I do think it leaves the viewer a little bit unsatisfied. My wife is also a big fan of The Last of Us, and she's played the first game and watched the gameplay through and the cutscenes of the second game because she hasn't played the second game. And so we know where this game is going, we know where the story's going, and it just feels like we're watching a subpar version of The Last of Us 2, which is already an incredibly cinematic game because graphics are so good at this point, and The Last of Us 2 is one of those games that really benefits from where video games are in terms of, just overall graphics. And so what you have here is a story that really does feel incomplete, and it's because it is, of course, but when you look at the first season, it feels like it has a beginning, middle, and end, with a cliffhanger that sets up what's to come in the second season, but it feels like there's enough of a story in that first season to tell a story, whereas this one just kind of felt like a season that was telling just part of a story and does leave you wanting more. But I don't necessarily know that the season as a whole felt as strong as season 1, to the point where there is that clamoring part of you that wants more immediately, the same way that you felt when you ended the first season. Now, I also want to mention immediately, I've been talking a little bit about my thoughts in terms of compared to the games and, Bella Ramsey as an actor and all these kind of things. One thing I want to praise about the show immediately, once again, is the set design. The locations used. I think that this is a very well shot show. I think for the most part, the cast is really solid. I really enjoy the acoustic heavy musical score that is very much in line with what the games have done. I really enjoy the overall aesthetic of this show. I think when it comes down to costume design, set design, locations used, overall action sequences, choreography, tension, musical score, all of that I think is really solid. That was something I praised heavily for the first season, and I think this season is no different. The production value is still very high, and I think for the most part, the entire cast really brings it in these roles, and I think for the most part, everybody feels like a pretty solid iteration of their character, except for Ellie, unfortunately, who is the main character. Now, one other character that's been criticized heavily is, of course, the one who kills Joel in this season, and that is the character of Abby, who's played by Caitlin Dever. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her name. Now, in the game, she's a very buff character, so she's very different. People didn't like that her character isn't different, but of course, if you've seen the season, her dad was killed by Joel at the end of the first season, and so that's what has her going after Joel. Of course, Ellie is there to see and witness this murder on Joel, and so Abby is the main person that we're seeking out for vengeance over the course of the season. And so people have been upset about the fact that she isn't as buff as she is in the game, but I do think that Caitlin does a good job in this role. I think she does a great job of conveying that sense of revenge and wanting to find Joel. I do think it feels a little bit rushed, especially with how fast she does find Joel, and they don't do enough with her across the entire season, but there is more of that to come, of course, with the show ending on a cliffhanger, leading into the segment of The Last of Us Part 2 where you play as Abby. So a lot of people who may not know that because they haven't played the games, yeah, that is why the show ended the way it does, because I think in season 2 we're going to go into that segment of the game where you play as Abby. You get to understand her side of the story a lot more as you lead up to the way that the show ends. But yeah, so Caitlin was a bit of a controversial pick in terms of an actress compared to the game for some people, but I do think she did a really solid job here, and I think for the most part the rest of the cast is solid. One new addition here is, of course, the love interest for Ellie, which is the character of Dina, who's played by Isabella Merced in this season, and she's just been great, man. I mean, I remember when I first saw her in Transformers, I thought, okay, whatever, and then she was enjoyable in that. But between Dora the Explorer, Alien Romulus last year, the upcoming Superman she's going to be in, I mean, she's killing it right now as a young actress, and I think she was great in this show. I would honestly say probably my favorite part of the season outside of the stuff with Pedro Pascal. In the scenes that we have with Pedro Pascal as Joel and Ellie, those are some of the best. Those are some of the best sequences. There is a flashback episode that is just about them before the events of this season that I thought to be maybe my favorite episode in the season, which really highlighted why the first season works so much. That chemistry of this father-like, hardened individual who really cares about this young girl he's found in this zombie apocalypse and is doing everything he can to make her life better. And that young, naive, kind of shit-talking girl that Ellie is, that chemistry is really what makes The Last of Us great. And so yeah, moving forward with it without him kind of was a bummer, even though I knew it was coming. And I think that really where I struggle with that is, even though I knew that, I just don't think really what I'm getting to here is that Bella Ramsey really was up to the challenge. I don't think that she really sold me on the grit and the unhinged nature that Ellie has in this portion of the story, because in the game she's a far different kind of character. I mean, for the most part, the vengeance is there in the show, but there's just choices that they made in terms of how to portray Ellie in this portion of her story that just didn't work for me. One of the main ones that's been made fun of by a lot of people is the scene where she finds out Dina's pregnant. It's completely different in the game than it is in the show.
Ellie. I think I'm pregnant. What? Don't worry, it's not yours.
What are we supposed to do now?
Nothing. I just need to rest for a second.
Are you fucking kidding me? How long have you known?
I was late a few weeks ago.
A few weeks? We could have still turned back.
I didn't know.
Holy shit. I'm gonna be a dad.
Yeah.
And that's just one example of moments that I just don't feel like they really captured Ellie the way that she is in the game. Now, mind you, this is an adaptation, so I'm okay with the notion of this being different than the game. But ultimately, for me, Bella Ramsey just feels so young and kiddie and kind of like whiny in this season, whereas I feel like the character calls for a little bit more grit, a little bit more edge, a little bit more just tooth and nail. Something about her has to be a little bit more hardened, and it just doesn't feel that way. It just feels like a kid whining and complaining and crying their way through situations. And I don't necessarily know that it's Bella Ramsey's fault. I just don't think she was the right actress for this role. I thought that when I saw her in the first season, and by the time we got to the end of season 2, I just didn't feel that. I just didn't feel her really in this role. You know, there were moments that worked, but it just left me feeling Now, outside of Ellie and Joel and Abby and my thoughts on, you know, casting and this, that, and the third, the other big part of this season that I genuinely feel was really interesting, but ultimately was never dived into enough, is the war that's going on between the Scars, the Seraphites, as well as the Wolves, which of course are part of the group that Ellie is going after. There's a war that's going on between these two, and we get to see Jeffrey Wright as the character of Isaac, who is torturing some of these Scars, trying to find things out and trying to uncover more about where they're coming from, where their attacks are going to be, you know, this, that, and the third, and we're trying to follow this oncoming battle that's going to be happening between the Scars and the Wolves. And I just never think that this season ever really found its footing in really getting the audience involved in that dilemma. Again, I know what's coming because I played the game, but I just felt like with the new things they added in and the way that they chose to explore that side of the story and only doing 7 episodes, I just feel like by the time we got to the end of the 7 episodes, not enough really happened. I mean, I feel like the first 2-3 episodes were really where the meat and potatoes of the show were, and then I felt like episodes 4, 5, 6, and 7 had moments, had big moments, had great character beats, especially in the last episode, especially, you know, with stuff with Ellie and finding some of the individuals leading up to the final moments with Abby. But it just felt like a lot of fluff. It felt like we were expanding the second game story for no real reason and not worth really expanding on elements in a really great way. I almost think that this season would have been substantially better with more episodes. It would have been substantially better if they honed certain episodes on the Scar individuals, on the Wolves, and maybe split up how they told Ellie and Abby's story in a different way than the game does. I don't necessarily know that The Last of Us 2 needed to be 2 seasons. I almost would have expected a longer second season to really just hone down some of these moments and make it feel a lot more compelling. And by the time we got to the end of The Last of Us Season 2, what I could say is I enjoyed watching it. I didn't dislike episode to episode, but as I got past episode 3, once I got to 4, 5, 6, 7, there was good moments. There was good episodes. I really liked that flashback episode with Joel and Ellie. But by the time we got to the end, I just was like, oh, you know, like The Last of Us 2 came and went, and I can't say I'm like clamoring for the 3rd season that's going to continue on the second game. I can just say more like, you know, I enjoyed it, but the hype just definitely doesn't feel as big as it did with the 1st season. And I do think a lot of that unfortunately has to do with how they chose to tell this story, despite the really high production value, but also because I just don't think Bella Ramsey is the right actress for Ellie in this stage of the character's life. I just don't, you know, and that is not hate towards her and her appearance or anything like that. If you have that kind of mindset, you need help. You need help, and you probably have some massive insecurities. I don't think anything is wrong with it with Bella Ramsey in terms of her physical appearance and this, that, and the third. I just didn't really buy her as this character. It just is what it is. And that's with a lot of actors and a lot of characters. You know, there's sometimes somebody feels miscast in a role. I think Bella Ramsey did well as Ellie in the stage of life that she was in the first game and in the first story, in the first season. But I just don't necessarily know that she was able to capture the full-on revenge-hungry grit that the second game is able to convey. I would almost rather watch cutscenes of The Last of Us Part 2 than watch this season. So that's going to be my rambly thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2. If this was a little bit all over the place, I'm sorry, I'm sick. I've been coughing, I've been sneezing, my eyes feel puffy. So this is my first time getting in front of camera in the last few days. So I'll be back with more reviews soon. But a big thanks to all of you guys for watching. If you got this far into the video, hit that like button if you guys enjoyed this video, and let me know what you guys thought. Did you like The Last of Us Part 2? Have you played the game? Have you not played the game? Whatever the case may be, leave any comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.